This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation. Hello everyone, my name is Marek Kądzielska-Koper and this is Common Sense Generation. And for the second episode I have two exquisite guests with us, Marek Matraszek and Jonathan Price. Thank you very much for both of you.
Thank you for having us back.
Yes, thank you.
Good to be back.
Well, it's good to talk with you, to meet both of you here, and to have this wonderful chat. In the previous episode, we talked a lot about Roger Scruton and how he sort of intellectually influenced all of us, and I would say also this video podcast. And the core of this intellectual tradition is the virtue of common sense, which is somewhere there. And this is also sort of my question, because I would say that people sometimes, especially on the left, which want to create some crazy revolution, they very often lose common sense. But it also happened to people on the right, especially when they fear something. So the fear is, I would say, something which take away common sense very rapidly and very quickly. And we experienced this recently, for example, through COVID pandemic. So Jonathan, starting with you, since you are an active philosopher, and
I'm an inactive one.
but you're like a volcano. But you're like a volcano when you're active. When you're active, you're on fire.
Well, but you're based there in academia. I would say academia loses common sense very often, and in a huge doses, a lot, and it loses also right now. Well, I would say very. A lot with all of those things connected to political correctness, which doesn't affect Poland that badly, but it affects many other countries, and especially British and American academia strongly. So how do you see this?
I'm in the academy a lot. I'm fortunate to be in a place that has some descriptive diversity and diversity of thought, because the university I'm part of is confederated, and so it has a bunch of private organizations that make a larger public one. But that's the odd university out. Most universities nowadays are controlled top down by somebody who is called something like a rector magnificus or something like that, and who provides policy that trickles down through from the president's office or the rector's office to the departments, to the professoriate, and down eventually to the students who come in bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, looking to learn about the wonders of the world, and are then turned immediately toward politics, or their education is immediately indexed to things that are very recent curiosities, rather than the wonders and curiosities and interests of the ages and of the natural world and of the life of the mind. So I'm day to day, I don't get assaulted by this as much as I think many of my colleagues and peers that I meet in other places do or are. But we do see it quite a lot. And what I think we see is the changing of the mission of the university from one to participate in that tradition of knowing, and the virtues that are attended on knowing, the attention that's necessary to know, the humility that's necessary to pursue truth, to a sort of position of instructor of society on how to achieve certain goals, perhaps emancipation being one of them, the emancipation of people from one class to another, with the university as that tool, which then would set its goals precisely alongside those of certain kinds of politics. And that would mean the new orthodoxies in the university have to become aligned with whatever the outworking of those politics would naturally be. Now, since those political ideas are not really routinely worked out in politics themselves, because politics tends to be somewhat allergic to ideas, the university is one of the places where they do get worked out and brought to their logical conclusion, which is, I think, one of the reasons why whenever I open my browser and it shows me the news, I see some of the most absurd conclusions of contemporary politics working themselves out first in the universities and then coming out of the universities into real politics, into everyday lives and whatnot. common sense. Sorry.
When you want to like sort of force people and do it, then you realize it's when it becomes real, you see the absurdity of it. And then I would say with the COVID pandemic, we saw the absurdity of how people who they seem to be like intellectually capable and very active and sometimes like great intellectuals, but then when there is the threat on the fear of death, which is of course something which affects us the most, and when we have to make those decisions, we are so much eager not to not to be independent in our actions, even if we say we are independent in our thoughts, but then we just lean on the state and we say, okay, we want them to resolve our problems, and we will stay indoors for half of a year because the government, it says, is safer. And just the fact that no fresh air, no sport, no being active or not meeting people might have a huge bad effect on me. Well, it doesn't matter, but in TV and the government says stay indoors. So
the primary goal of politics nowadays seems to be the provision, the avoidance of pain and suffering in individuals. And I think that's probably been present for the last, at least since the end of the Second World War, as stated goals of Western governments, rather than all of the other goals we might imagine. Which one might I suggest? Another one would be, Aristotle's understanding was we don't need the city unless we want to thrive. We can survive without the city. But if we want to thrive, the city provides us, the polis, the political community provides us with things we couldn't even imagine were possible unless we combined our resources. But that thriving doesn't seem to be the goal of contemporary Western European politics. It's avoiding suffering and avoiding pain.
Well, I agree with you. There's so many things that both of you have touched on that are very interesting. One certainly is the fact that one of the peculiarities of modernity is actually the loss of sense of death. Death was a common experience right until the beginning of the 20th, actually right until the middle of the 20th century. It was a normal aspect of human existence to be confronted by death, whether it was through war or through pestilence or illness, child death. This was actually the norm, and it actually was one of the reasons why, and it's the loss of this sense of mortality and of the finiteness of human existence, which I think is leading to this hubris that we can actually be masters of everything if only we apply ourselves. In other words, that we can put off death, we can put off misfortune, only if we apply the scientific method, which is the great revolutionary mindset of the 19th and 20th century. And that's one of the sources of failing. But I think to go to a sort of a slightly deeper point, because you mentioned this session was to be based on the concept of common sense. So what is common sense? I think one of the ways in which it's useful to think about thinking is actually when we were talking about Roger Scruton in our last episode, the last time we met. And Roger was one of those people who recognized that actually what common sense, which is often derided by intellectuals or people who just have a scientific worldview of life, is something which is incredibly valuable. Because common sense is really what you might call the distillation of human experience, which ordinary people come into possession of, not through scientific education, but through common experience, inheritance of knowledge, of traditions, of family values, of religion, of moral sentiments, which are transmitted through the church, or through other senses of belonging. And these are very valuable instincts, which are often misrepresented as being sort of vulgar or unsophisticated, but actually they're very deep sentiments which have a fundamental basis in human experience. So this was going back to Roger, one of his great insights is that the world of experience is as much value as the world of science. That goes back to your comments about COVID, where really people had a very common sense view of the implications of some of the lockdown strategies. And what we're seeing now today, the long-term effects of COVID lockdown, where some of the more valuable things, such as a sense of community, belonging, family integration, social integration, education of young people, all this is fragmenting, particularly because ultimately these are very fragile human constructs, which lockdown, even though it was relatively short for a year or 18 months, has succeeded in destroying. But to go back to a more sort of conservative perspective, I think on the other hand, a sort of a more deeper conservative position is to say, well, human instinct is all very well, but there's also something which is a danger in human instinct, which is human passions. And I think there's also a realization, sort of going right back to the Greek period, that human passions themselves require limitation. That's why you need institutions. That's why you need culture. That's why you need law, because ultimately these things also can run amok. But you need two things for social order. One, you need human instinct, but you also need institutions which show us what the limit of our instincts should be. And I think that's what's so valuable in civilizational inheritance. And that's actually what modernity actually challenges. It challenges the view that there is something valuable in things which we haven't constructed, that we've actually inherited. It seems very reactionary. And there is a sense that the only reality is the scientific reality. And it doesn't actually take into account the world of value, which is something that conservatives very firmly believe is actually derived from non-scientific perceptions of the world, such as religion or culture or habit. So it all rolls into one thing, that actually what is valuable, that we shouldn't denigrate what our gut instinct is. Sometimes it's actually very, very true.
This is Common Sense Generation. If you like this channel, please subscribe, share, and comment. Your voice really matters. And just the fact that that's what I think my generation at least wants to forget, is that we are standing on the shoulders of the giant. And when we forget about it, that we forget that we use language which was used and phrases which were used by people before us, and that we have to cherish it somehow. And it's not like they were more stupid than we are. They were like less educated or everything else, or like less practical, or they were just idiots out there. And then we are right now so wonderful. We know how to do everything, and that's why we shouldn't look at all what's back there. That's definitely stupid, and that's definitely what kills. Just then we start to behave like we lose the common sense. We just go very often with a flock, and then find out ourselves with closed forests and not flying somewhere because we don't have the right document, or actually making the test every time it's required or asked, which I thought was a form of taxation. Even just give me a test, just pay for it, basically. So not without avoiding it, but people in Eastern Europe, because they have this experience of communism in society, when the law was absurdity, when the law was without the common sense, they have this fear of personal freedom, sometimes bigger when reacting. Okay, this is something stupid. The government is doing something crazy. We have to oppose. We have to create our small sphere of, let's say, black market and thrive here. I would say Poland was thriving with false tests, COVID tests, the whole pandemic. I think it was the biggest shop of creating them with every single computer. But it seems like people...
You mean a document that says you've had a test?
Yeah, of course. And this is something with the Western world is okay. Sometimes not. They are more disciplined, more believe that the government is right, and. But of course, there's the other part of it when you have this chaos, because leads to some total not respecting law, goes to the chaos, which we still observe, I would say, in some post-communist countries. Let's say Georgia, there is a certain level of chaos right now because of the Ukraine war in Ukraine. We see this chaos thriving. There are the small groups of power having some territories, a lot of black market, everything which we seem as normal doesn't exist there anymore. And there is this wall here, and then the European Union and the West, like European Union still thinks, we live here in this bubble where everything seems to be as it was before, like let's say 15, 20 years ago. No threat of war, no threat of any. We're not afraid of our life. So is not a threat. That's what at least what I see. But you could see this let's say a threat of losing common sense by two things: one, pandemic, and then very quickly the war with Ukraine, which might be just the start of something even worse. What do you think about it?
There was a lot to think about there. I wanted to return quickly to something you said earlier. Two words that were said earlier. One was virtue and one was sentiment. You use sentiment and you use virtue in reference to common sense. Maybe in our previous conversation you spoke initially about it as a virtue. Common sense strikes me to be like manners. Good table manners. There's no such thing as universal table manners. And it would be absurd for us to imagine anything like universal table manners, in part because the table isn't universally used as the place to eat in every human society, known only in some. Although most of us have realized at some point it would make sense to put something that, is something in the middle where things can be placed on and shared. But, manners for eating are not universal. But every society has developed ways of eating such that anyone cannot just take what he wants at any time when he's hungry, and that sometimes one is asked to eat even if he's not hungry. And it extends on from there, that there's set times when food is likely to be provisioned, that there's a way of relating to others who are eating with you so that we don't just rush the food, rip it up, and that the strongest gets it, right? And if you think of manners as an analogy to common sense I think is a virtue. So it's a disposition. It's a kind of prejudice that's built up in us to go for some kinds of answers before others, those that we've learned, those that we've inherited, those that have been taught to us from our youngest. And it's also because of that, because it's a virtue, it deals with our affectual life. It deals with our emotions. It deals with the training of our desires, which is something I think you rightly brought up, the training of the passions. When we have common sense, we're enmeshed in a society to such a degree that without thinking, when something happens, we would know what the way is that we should react, the common way. And sense here, it means reasonable, right? It means it's the common meaning of reasonable action in the circumstance. We don't think it through like that unless there's a question, unless someone says, "Oh, that's why would you do that? That's absurd. That's stupid. That's unreasonable." And you say, "No, that's common sense." And then there's an argument about whether it is or not. But ordinary common sense is just participated in like an ordinary virtue, an intellectual virtue, which also touches on moral virtues and social virtues and practical virtues. And it capacitates quite a lot, actually. It combines quite a lot. And that's one of the reasons it's easy to speak about on the one hand and hard to define.
Very hard to define, definitely.
But I think you get there. And like with other things, beauty, for instance, or bad manners, they're tested in their absence or at their limits rather than in their presence. Right?
Right, absolutely.
I think common sense sounds so banal and everyday, but that's actually what it is. And there are two aspects of common sense which I think are worth reflecting on. One of which, it presumes the imperfectibility of existence. In other words, there has to be compromise. There has to be some sort of equilibrium. There has to be some sort of balance between what is good and evil. And secondly, common sense is very much rooted in the here and now. It's about the solution of practical moral dilemmas on a day-to-day basis. And both of these things are actually something which are very fragile. Because on the one hand, the sense that there is a permanence of imperfection in the world, and that the real calling of us is to find a muddle through these complexities of existence, is something which is challenged by the very modern worldview, is that there is a perfection in the world. and that we are, in other words, that we are actually on a historical path of liberating ourselves from imperfection and liberating ourselves from those things which limit our freedoms. So if you go back in history, it's the erosion of a belief in the transcendent. So we're liberating ourselves from God. Then in the revolutionary mantras of the 19th and 20th century, it's about a liberation from institutions. And we come to the point today where actually we sense that that we need to liberate ourselves from our own bodies,
from nature,
from nature itself.
Yeah, that's right.
And so that is actually a very modern. It's a tendency which has grown and grown over the last 100, 200 years, of this sense of the need to liberate oneself from the exigencies of existence. Whereas common sense implies that existence is what it is. The second thing that common sense sort of assumes is that there is a here and now that is where morality and decisions need to be implemented. That actually runs counter to the other fantasy of the modern mind, which is that there is a teleology to human existence. In other words, that we are on a path to perfection, that we are on a path to liberation, we are on a path to secular salvation. And common sense is seen as some sort of conservative reactionary posture, which actually says, it's not about common sense. There is actually a revolutionary impulse that we have to move forward. We have to liberate ourselves from things that seem natural, because actually they're an expression of white supremacy, or they're an expression of some sort of capitalist indoctrination or whatever. So common sense is actually a very dangerous thought to the progressive mind, because it implies there is a here and now which is permanent, and it also says perfection is actually impossible, that the challenge of life is about finding consensus and compromise in order to move through life in a consensual and friendly way with one's surroundings. And that's something which is today actually a very reactionary thought to have, and that's why it's so hotly contested by those who say that they ought to put the principles of scientism first, or the ideals of progress. Common sense is a very robust position to have in today's modern world.
It's a robust position, and that was really well said. It's a robust position, and like the Aristotelian virtues, it's embattled not only by the progressive modern denial of the possibility of common sense or the uses of common sense, but also by, on the other side, Aristotle's virtues are a mean between two opposing extremes, and on the other side, what we might call a kind of populist provinciality of the now, that says the way my people do things, the way we, like a smaller group, do things, is the only way they should be done. And that's what common sense is often accused of being, when it's not. It's something bigger than that. It's something more expansive. It's something more inclusive than that. But I worry that in places like in the United States, and to a certain degree on the right, the populist right in Britain, and especially on the populist right that we sometimes come across in Europe when we try to distinguish ourselves as conservatives from the populist right, we see people who have doubled down on things and called them common sense just because they're common. Right?
Because they're popular.
They're ours, or because they're ours. They say, well, we do it this way, and then they make a party, politics often, or a movement out of doing things our way rather than some other person's way, progressives or immigrants or other people. And that, I think, falls outside of common sense, especially because it has a way of knowing that isn't open the way, we haven't used the word yet, but the way phronesis would be, right? The elevation of practical reason is another way of talking about the use of the common sense in practice, and doubling down on a position that basically says the way we do things now, not yesterday, not tomorrow, is the way they should be done all times by people like us, is the position that we find ourselves often guarding against when we're out speaking about the virtues of common sense in public, and someone says, oh yeah, we have common sense too, and then describes to you a populist position. we're in little danger typically of having certain kinds of progressives join the movement, but we welcome them if they want to join a movement for common sense. But I think for the reasons you rightly identified, imperfectibility involves a doctrine of sin.
So just to
Absolutely
put it, just to summarize it, what you said, it basically is that it's not against change, or it's not against or changing and getting things better, but it just acknowledged the fact that things were there are good ways of resolving certain problems, and we can do it. And at least we have to respect how it was done before.
Yeah.
It's a Burkean position.
Absolutely. But one thing which I find myself, I want to sort of push you a little bit out of the academic way of talking about it, to see where we actually see the clash of it and the lack of the common sense. I think when we have an individual or a group of individuals which are forced by either the state or other form of authority, who's trying to implement certain ways of doing things, suddenly which are against what is known as common sense, or which seems reasonable.
Well, this is, I think, what ideology is. And
exactly.
Ideology is an attempt to understand the world, put the cart before the horse, essentially, to have an idea and to interpret the world purely through this idea, which can be an institutional idea, it can be an idea of change, and it really recategorizes morality, because it essentially redefines morality as to what is or what is not in line with one's ideology. Whereas morality, as we understand it, is ultimately something which is above everyday politics. It's above everyday human choices, but it's really something which is constant, and it's something that cannot be reduced to a teleological goal. In other words, if you're going somewhere, morality is what is in line with that goal, and what is immoral is aligned with what is against that goal. And I think this is the loss of the sense that the moral order is defined by something beyond us. And this is where you get into religion, which is going to be a big topic, I'm sure, of one of your future video podcasts. But ultimately, I think so. The problem of modernity, and this is the problem of common sense, is that it's challenged by the sense that we have lost the perception that morality is not humanly created. It can be either given to us by God, or it can be filtered down through culture. And that's how we then take those moral values and make those everyday choices that we define as common sense choices. In other words, it's this sense that we are working on criteria of choice which are not of our making. And that's very much against much of the modern spirit, which is to say, actually, we define what morality is. We can decide on what is good or evil according to what our directed goals are. And so that's what I think the real battle today in the world is about, these two views of the sources of morality and how morality interacts with everyday choices.
This was actually also my intuition in a way of speaking about it, that even on the silly example of pandemic, which affected many ways of life, but when the fear of death becomes the most important, to persevere life, then we suddenly go to those crazy positions, such as accepting certain laws, when we forget about. For example, I remember I didn't think it through this way in the moment of pandemic, but I remember one thing when they asked us totally to just stay in and not doing nothing, and I said, okay, but at least I consider myself a Christian, so I said, Christian is not afraid of death. Yeah. If I'm good, I'm just supposed to sacrifice.
Well, nobody's really pro-death, but they are living sensibly, and ultimately, this fetishization of health removed from public policy of politicians, the need to balance that imperative with other imperatives, because health is not just physical health, it's also mental health, it's also social, societal health. It's the value that comes from communities which were being destroyed. It comes from the losses that we suffered when we weren't allowed to go to church, even to sort of commune in our own way. So mental health, I think, became something which was completely ignored just because of this fetishization of physical health, which ultimately, most people in retrospect would now say that the way to have dealt with COVID would have been to recognise there was a real health challenge to the elderly and to the vulnerable, and perhaps they should have been protected, vaccinated, and so on. But ultimately, the whole sphere, we're now seeing the fallout of the destruction of communities and communal existence reflected in mental health of young people, a greater social anomie that's leading into declining birth rates. It's the domino effect of this has actually turned out to be much worse than the actual impact of COVID itself. So that it's this denial of the need for balance, which goes back to common sense, which I think we're now seeing was the big mistake of the COVID period.
I think at the time, what became noticed by many people at the time that hadn't been noted as much beforehand was the inability of ordinary persons to act based on common sense or just a shared sense of the level of crisis in their own interest, because many of our governments over the last 70 or 80 years have provided us with things like healthcare, help when we're out of work, education, and all the rest. And we've gotten very used to moving the responsibility for the provision of this up and up and up, which simultaneously meant that the levels between the top and the bottom had less and less power to make rules or regulations or to provide the norms in their own right. They often didn't have the legitimacy to do it, but they'd lost the authority to do it as well. And so when there was an existential, a bodily crisis, a crisis of people thought my very being is on the line, they all looked up. And to a certain degree, who could blame them? The subsidiarity that would have existed in most European countries before the revolutionary movements gradually made it impossible, and before, frankly, technology and real progress caused us to look to new institutions for health and safety and the rest, left many of us bereft of the ability to care for ourselves when we needed to. And another way to look at the lockdown policies was, what else were large state organizations going to do when people were knocking on their doors, panicking, saying, "Save us from the plague, save us from death"? Mm-hmm. They have one lever to pull. The lever is close it down. And they had the power to do it, and they had the authority to do it, and they were followed when they did do it. I think that strikes me as a profound disconnect between something we haven't actually mentioned is common sense relies implicitly on the ability to go out in the world and act and have your actions be respected in some way or stick. So giving someone the freedom to develop common sense, but never the ability to act in his own right, is like giving a man the ability to feed himself, but no arms. Mm. Yeah, and I think many of us found ourselves in that position in the pandemic, saying even if I wanted to do something that I understand to be common sense now, it's either illegal, or I don't have the institutions or the community or if I do, they don't have the authority or the legitimacy, the legal status to allow me to do it.
Yeah, one of the sad experiences of COVID was how far we learnt that common sense is actually not very common.
Absolutely.
And how eager we were to divest ourselves of responsibility, how happy we were to give authority away, and also how happy and delighted we were to start informing on other people. And we became our own policemen. And you remember during COVID, you don't have that mask on. And the culture of denunciation was something which erupted under COVID. It was actually fascinating to see, particularly in Western liberal society. And it actually it reflects on a sort of, I think, a deeper understanding as a result of this of how fragile common sense is, and that it's not a spontaneous normality. It's something which has to be nurtured and protected and educated at every point in someone's life. It's not a spontaneous human condition. The spontaneous human condition is actually to be enslaved, to give away freedom. And the respect for freedom, I think, is something which has to be recognized as a product of culture. And that culture needs to be protected, dignified, it has to be educated into each generation in succession that comes along. Otherwise, it can be very easily frittered away, and we saw how easily our freedoms were given away when we lost that sense of how valuable freedom is.
Absolutely, and I think it's a wonderful point to wrap up this episode and to say, first of all, I do hope that this video podcast, Common Sense Generation, will become this platform for cultivating common sense and the bravery and the form of education for at least my generation, but I hope for many others as well, that we have this free speech and we are educating something from a different point of view. Marek, Jonathan, thank you very much for being my guest.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope so it was not the last time. But to all of you, the viewers of Common Sense Generation, thank you for listening to us, watching us, and we also thank to our partner, Polish National Foundation, who helped us with this episode. And, well, stay tuned. This is Common Sense Generation.